group-wide leadership. And at the moment we're working on, the dance card is this idea I think is gaining traction. The dance card is getting somewhat full, but the ones that we are trying to work on at the moment are finance. And why is that? Well, actually, agencies for the foreseeable future are going to have to get much smarter about their financial management, how they make strategic decisions, and typically we haven't had strategic financial advice at the top table of sufficient quality, given the fiscal environment agencies are facing. ICT, clearly changes in service delivery in many cases are going to need to be enabled by ICT, and we have a very patchy ICT profession. Human resources and organisational development, if we are wanting to have organisations that really have good practice around leadership of people in their organisations, they need a much higher general level of skill and expertise in that profession. And actually the fourth profession that we're looking at the moment is the policy profession. And I want to come to that because I think policy profession is a good example about one of these ubiquitous professions. It's in a lot of agencies. There are pockets of really good practice. But if we think about the world that we're going into, and in particularly my point earlier about how do we actually as a system demonstrate that we can act on those fast feedback loops, the policy profession I think needs to be in a very different space to what it's currently in, so that it doesn't become a bottleneck on successful reform of the state sector. And what I mean by that is I think as we're going through this quiet revolution in service delivery, and we're getting increasingly granular understanding about the experience of communities, of the business community, we're getting much better understanding of the effectiveness of interventions, whether that's at a national level or a local level. We're now getting a huge amount of data and information that can reinvigorate the policy profession. Whether you're talking about at the big data level where you're integrating multiple data sets across multiple agencies to really define a pipeline of interventions that needs to be applied to particular communities over time, or whether it's very local information. There's a huge asset there. But at the moment, our policy profession, I think, has two significant issues. One is its vertical connections are generally not strong enough. And what I mean by those vertical connections, it's the connections between policy advice, service delivery, an understanding of the partners who need to be engaged to make good policy work, whether that's the private sector and NGOs. There still is some degree of a sort of monastic nature of the policy profession, at least in New Zealand. And secondly, at the same time as those vertical connections are being strengthened, are those horizontal connections, which reflects the importance of policy effectiveness in the world that we're in, which has an understanding about how various policy settings interface with each other, how do they interact, and the need for much better joined up policy advice to policy advisors. So in terms of that idea about mobilising the ubiquitous professions, reinvigorating the policy profession for me is a real priority. It's an opportunity, I think, to pick up some of the issues about regulatory policy that Murray Shu and his colleagues have put on the table with their report. And it's a piece of work that we and the Commission are doing with our colleagues in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. And I think out of that will come the idea of a head of profession, which probably is going to be in the Prime Minister's department, which is really about where's the focal point of system assurance for the policy profession. So in these, if you like, ubiquitous professions that are systemically important, I think the model that we will see over the next 3 or 4 years is that there is a point of system accountability about the health and ongoing development of those professions. So that, I think, will help us to actually deliver some of the shifts in performance that we are looking at. The second issue that I think we need to really embed over the next few years is this idea about the long-term view. And what we use the shorthand is stewardship. Last year, the Parliament changed State Sector Act, that is the governing piece of legislation for the public sector. And one of the piece of changes that I was very pleased that Parliament made was that they basically took on board the advice that they had from officials, which was to make very explicit the responsibilities for Chief Executive around stewardship. And there are a number of dimensions of stewardship that are reflected in the State Sector Act. And first is the ability to tender free and frank advice to successive governments. So that's a notion both of the professionalism and the professional, politically impartial nature of offering advice. And the idea about successive governments is that sense of the medium to long term, that ability to actually be prepared to either seize opportunities or to help, as Jenny Shipley was talking about, shape the future. Stewardship is also about, in the State Sector Act, is around the capabilities in an organisation. So it's that sense that the organisation, the responsibility of a chief executive needs to be not just focused on delivering to the minister himself or herself today, but asking the question about what does this organisation need to look like when I walk out the door in 2 or 3 or 5 years' time. It also implies about the question about what sort of assets does the department need to be delivering its business over time, and that those assets are regularly updated in a way that the capacity to deliver is maintained over time. And I think that is a very big cultural shift for us. We can't get away from the imperatives about delivering to current ministers, and I'm not naive that we're suddenly going to have a public service that's focused loftily on the medium term tomorrow. But it's a bit about how does our system begin to lean against those short-term pressures. We've taken that idea about system stewardship into a revised set of expectations for chief executives and secretaries, and very explicitly part now of their performance assessments is their performance around the various dimensions of stewardship. So I think stewardship is a key idea in thinking how we handle the issues that face us over the long term. The fourth issue, I think, is the importance of leadership in organisations and what do leaders do. It's very important, I think, in this environment where we are asking public servants right through organisations to operate in somewhat different and challenging ways from ways that they have operated in historically, that behaviour is validated and strongly affirmed by senior leadership. So what happens at the top table really matters. And I'll give you a little story about that. At the moment within the Commission, we're working with a number of agencies about how do we embed ideas around continuous improvement. And we're running a series of pilots, and one of the pilots that we're running is at Auckland Airport, where we're trying to reconfigure our departures process. And that requires a number of agencies to work together. It involves Statistics New Zealand. They're the people who use the data off your departure card when you leave New Zealand. It involves our customs agency, involves our aviation security agency, which is a Crown entity, and of course it involves Auckland Airport, which is a largely privately owned company. And that's a process that's been very energetic and creative. And when we've tried to understand what's made the difference, it's been the role of senior leaders to champion, to be visible, in that process, and to actually understand the perspective that customers are expressing. And one of the techniques that's used very often in continuous improvement programs is to get people who are delivering the service just to observe the experience of customers. And that was one of the observations that was made to us by staff involved in this. We never stopped to look at this process. And I went up to Auckland Airport, and this applied to their senior leaders. I went up to Auckland Airport and was just standing there. And there's a woman obviously thought I knew something about what was happening, somewhat mistakenly. But she came up to me, and she was English. And she said, and I won't do the English accent, we're flying business class. Do we need to stand in the queue? And there's quite a long queue. It reminded me a bit about, no sex, please, we're English. It was a bit like that, but in a sense it was sort of quite powerful because actually it brought home the customer experience. And notwithstanding the person thought they were special because they're flying business class, actually this experience wasn't working for them as a customer. And that kind of experience was very impactful on the senior leaders of the agencies that actually design and operate those experiences day in, day out. And so it highlights the importance of the senior leadership team in making some of the changes that we're talking about. It's also a bit about, in the world that I'm advocating, is that people are at the core of a reinvigorated, fit-for-purpose state sector. It's about what do leaders spend their time on. Recently, I was in the United Kingdom, and I spent some time with the Chief Executive and senior team at Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, which was quite an interesting organisation. It's a very large organisation, and it started to downsize prior to the GFC, so I think in about 2006 it was about 110,000. And with the fiscal consolidation UK, there's been a lot of job cuts, a lot of changes in the way they're operating their business. It's now down to 63,000, and there's probably another 15 to 20% to come out to their workforce. So really big shift. And I was talking to the senior team about what's changed for you as a senior team. And they were very clear, we now spend much more time on our people. Who are our talent? Where are they? How are we developing them? How are we recruiting them? How are they feeling? I said, well, how much of your time do you spend as a team on your people? And they said 30%. And I suppose I'd sort of put a challenge out there. How many of your for those of you on senior teams, how many of your senior teams spend 30% of your time focusing on your people? And they're doing that because of the nature of the kinds of service delivery changes that they're going through, and the importance particularly of leaders right through the organisation about being able to champion, to make those changes so that you get successful transformation. So that sense about what happens at the top table and its focus is very important here. The second point, I think, is the importance of thinking about leadership roles, not just in an agency context, but a system context. And I think one of the shifts in New Zealand coming out of the Better Public Services report in 2011 was this idea that actually, if you care about the system, you have to make a leader or leaders accountable for the system. So hence in 2012, the Commissioner was given the role of Head of the State Services, and the role is ultimately, I'm accountable for the overall performance of the system. And that is now within our organisation is having a huge impact that will roll out over several years, because we're now having to think about how would we assess the health of the system? What would we look at? How would we assess risks and opportunities? And we've taken that approach through to some of the key areas that we're working on. For example, the Government Chief Information Officer now has a role around their assurance around ICT across the system, as I said, and we're taking that approach in the Head of Profession approach. That sense about leaders, if we're wanting the system to work as a system, we're going to have leaders that are assuring the public service system and the political leadership that the system is working well. The kinds of leadership that we're talking about to deliver for results for New Zealanders in the future means that we need to be investing much more on leadership through the pipeline. Some of the attributes of leadership that we're talking about, that agility to work across organisational cultures, to work in different sectors, it's a way easier to start working with public service leaders on those issues in what we call the early careers phase. So at the moment we've just signed off a package which will be looking at changing experience for interns, graduates and emerging leaders. And what we're trying to do there is this is very much an investment for senior leaders in 10 or 15 or 20 years' time, is to both give those leaders an understanding about what it means to be part of a system, what does it mean for you as to be a system leader, to give them a sense about a set of experiences that give them a sense of the diversity of worlds that they need to be comfortable in. And that includes being very comfortable about them working in the private sector, going and working overseas, even in a place like Australia. Those are all kinds of experiences that will kind of enrich them as leaders. And at the moment, we're also working on senior leaders, because by and large, they are the senior leaders that we will have for the next 3 or 4 years, when we've got a lot of things to do as a system. But increasingly wanting to take that view of a leadership pipeline that's at different phases of maturity and development. I think it also means that we will need to become much more professional about how we develop leaders. I was at a forum on leadership about a year ago in one of our departments, and Chief Executive had invited one of the leadership developers from New Zealand Rugby. And he basically described what New Zealand Rugby does around identifying rugby talent, working with rugby talent. And it made me realise that we in the public service still have a very rudimentary approach around the information that we provide to leaders about their effectiveness. If you're a 15-year-old who might go and play Super 15 and then one day you might go into the All Blacks, you know an awful lot about your performance, whether that's on the field, how many tackles do you put in, how many metres do you get with each of your breaks. There's a whole lot of stuff about what happens to you off the field, how your body responds to different kinds of diets, etc. So in a sense that there's a huge amount of feedback that you're getting as a player to allow you to be optimal. Now, we don't do that in the public service, but we have leaders who are leaders for 10 or 20 or 30 years' time who the public purse pays an awful lot of money to, and we could do much better in that regard. The final point I'd make is, in this context, collective leadership is really important, because the kinds of shifts that I'm talking about really much are a decade of change, and they have to actually endure across changes in political leadership, and they have to actually endure across changes in bureaucratic leadership. And the best way I think that actually we can support that kind of enduring approach around change is that there's a collective approach around how do we need to change as a system. And reflecting that, for the first time in New Zealand, all chief executives will be signing up to what's called the BIG, which is the briefing to the incoming government, which will be a collective view about how our system should operate to deliver on the ambitions of the incoming government. And each chief executive will engage with his or her own minister in addition to their agency briefing around that wider governmental briefing. And that, I think, is an expression for us about the value and power of collective leadership about delivering the system that we want to. So in summary, I think this is a great time for public servants to seize our destiny in our own hands. No one is going to reform our system consistently except us. We have a huge opportunity to contribute to the welfare and prosperity of our communities. and ultimately I think that's what all gets us all out of bed in the morning. Thank you.